Blackwater Island sat like a forgotten tombstone in the middle of Lake Superior, shrouded in fog and local warnings about cursed ground. The government had been trying to sell it for decades. Contaminated soil, they claimed. Unstable foundation, worthless rock. Jake Morrison knew better. 20 years swinging hammers had taught him to read the land like a book, and something about the geological surveys didn't add up. When he placed that $1 bid, his crew chief called him an idiot. His ex-wife said it proved he'd finally lost his mind. But Jake had spent 2 tours as a military engineer before picking up construction work. He recognized the telltale signs of deliberate cover-ups, the kind that left paper trails and shallow graves. His first day on the island, 6 feet down with his excavator, the bucket struck something that shouldn't exist, a sealed titanium vault bearing Soviet markings from 1962. Inside that vault, Jake found files that made the Cuban Missile Crisis look like a warm-up act, files that certain people would kill to recover. But what terrified him most wasn't what he'd found. It was realizing someone had been watching him dig. Why had the government really been so eager to sell this island? The metallic clang still echoed in Jake's ears as he stared at the excavator bucket, now bent at an odd angle where it had struck the vault. He'd been digging what should have been a simple foundation for a small cabin, his retirement plan, a place to disappear from the world. Instead, the world had found him. Jake shut off the engine and climbed down, his work boots squelching in the muddy pit. The September wind cut through his flannel shirt as he approached the exposed corner of what looked like a metallic coffin. The titanium gleamed dully despite decades underground, unmarked by rust or decay. Cyrillic letters were etched into its surface, surrounding what appeared to be a radiation warning symbol. He'd seen enough ordnance in Afghanistan to know this wasn't some forgotten mining equipment. This was military grade, built to survive nuclear winter. The vault's electronic lock had failed years ago, corroded by moisture that had seeped through hairline cracks. Jake pried it open with a crowbar, half expecting to trigger some Cold War booby trap. Instead, he found silence and the smell of old paper. The files inside were wrapped in waterproof plastic, pristine despite their age. As Jake flipped through the documents by the light of his phone's flashlight, his blood ran cold. Operation North Star, submarine routes, nuclear payload manifests, names and dates that any history buff would recognize, except these showed a completely different version of events than what appeared in textbooks. According to these papers, the Cuban Missile Crisis hadn't ended with Soviet ships turning back. It had escalated far beyond what the public ever knew. Blackwater Island had been a secret staging ground, a place where both superpowers had hidden assets too dangerous for their own soil. Jake photographed several pages before his hands started shaking. He wasn't holding history. He was holding dynamite, the kind that toppled governments and got curious construction workers buried in unmarked graves. A twig snapped in the tree line behind him. Jake's military training kicked in instantly. He pocketed his phone and dropped low, using the excavator as cover. The island was supposed to be deserted. He'd been the only passenger on the ferry that morning, and the captain had made it clear he wouldn't be back for a week. Through the excavator's tracks, he caught a glimpse of movement, a figure in dark clothing, too far away to make out details, but close enough to have been watching him work. Professional surveillance, the kind that stayed hidden until it was too late. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Government cleanup crew, foreign intelligence, corporate interests. In his experience, when people killed to protect secrets, they didn't particularly care who got caught in the crossfire. The figure melted back into the forest, but Jake knew they weren't gone. They were repositioning, probably calling for backup. He had minutes, maybe less, before this turned ugly. Moving quickly but quietly, Jake sealed the most damaging files in a plastic tool bag and covered the vault with a tarp. To casual observation, it would look like construction debris. He fired up the excavator and began filling in the hole, working with the desperate efficiency of a man who understood exactly how much danger he was in. As dirt cascaded over the vault, Jake's radio crackled to life, the emergency frequency he monitored out of old habit. Static, then a voice speaking in clipped, professional tones, target acquired. Initiate containment protocol. Jake's blood turned to ice water. Military terminology, government black ops. Whatever he'd stumbled into, it was big enough to mobilize serious resources. The ferry wouldn't return for 6 days. His satellite phone had mysteriously stopped working that morning, something he'd attributed to the weather. Now he understood it was sabotage. Someone had wanted him isolated on this island, either to silence him permanently or to search for what he'd found without witnesses. Jake Morrison had bought an island for $1 and discovered why it was really worthless. Not because of the land, but because of the secrets buried beneath it. Secrets worth killing for. The boat's engine coughed to life on the third pull, sending a cloud of blue smoke across the marina. Jake adjusted his tool belt and checked the coordinates one more time. Kellam Island, his island, sat 12 miles offshore in the choppy waters of Puget Sound, a forgotten dot on maritime charts that most sailors avoided due to its reputation for treacherous currents. The auction had been a joke among his crew at Morrison Construction. Who buys an island sight unseen for $1? The kind of fool who'd grown tired of building other people's dreams, apparently. Jake had spent 15 years framing houses and pouring foundations, watching Seattle's skyline transform while his bank account remained stubbornly modest. When the General Services Administration announced surplus properties for auction, including a 2.3-acre island with no commercial value, something had clicked. Now, as the mainland shrank behind him, Jake wondered if his co-workers had been right to laugh. The island materialized through morning mist like a sleeping giant. Dense evergreens crowned its center, while rocky shores dropped sharply into dark water. A small crescent beach offered the only obvious landing spot, marked by the skeletal remains of what might have been a dock decades ago. Jake beached his skiff and pulled it above the tide line. The silence hit him immediately. No traffic, no construction noise, just wind through pine needles and waves against stone. He'd expected to feel foolish. Instead, an unexpected sense of ownership washed over him. This was his. The preliminary survey would take most of the day. Jake had brought his transit level, measuring tape, and soil auger, enough equipment to determine if the island could support the small cabin he'd been sketching for months. Nothing fancy, just a weekend retreat where he could escape the city's relentless pace. He started at the beach, working methodically inland. The soil composition looked promising near the waterline, rocky but stable. As he moved upslope through thick underbrush, his auger samples showed layers of clay and decomposed granite that would provide solid footing for a foundation. It was the metal detector's sharp beep that changed everything. Jake had brought the device almost as an afterthought, hoping to clear any buried debris before breaking ground. Instead, 30 feet from the island's highest point, the detector screamed. He knelt and began carefully excavating with his folding shovel. 6 inches down, his blade struck something hard. What emerged from the earth made him sit back on his heels, a metal corner, green with oxidation but unmistakably man-made. Jake worked faster now, excitement overriding caution as he uncovered what appeared to be a buried container, roughly the size of a briefcase but heavier, much heavier. The latch had corroded shut, but a few taps with his hammer broke it free. Jake lifted the lid and felt his breath catch. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oiled cloth, lay stacks of documents. But these weren't the property deeds or old surveys he might have expected. Even water-damaged and faded, he could make out letterheads that made his pulse quicken. Department of Defense, Atomic Energy Commission, classified markings stamped in red ink. Beneath the papers, his fingers found something that made him jerk his hand back. A small device, cylindrical and metallic, with warning symbols that needed no translation. Jake had done enough industrial construction to recognize radioactive material warnings when he saw them. He closed the container carefully and stood, mind racing. Whatever he'd found, it had been buried here deliberately, hidden on an island the government had deemed worthless enough to auction for pocket change. The dates on the visible documents suggested the 1950s, an era when the Pacific Northwest had hosted nuclear programs that remained classified even today. A sound made him freeze, the distant rumble of an approaching engine. Jake crouched behind a fallen log, container clutched against his chest, and watched a sleek powerboat cut through the swells toward his island. Two figures stood in the bow, one scanning the shoreline with binoculars while the other spoke into what looked like a satellite phone. They'd found his skiff. The men beached their boat 20 yards from his own and stepped ashore with military precision. Both wore dark clothing and moved with the controlled efficiency of people accustomed to dangerous work. Jake couldn't hear their conversation over the wind, but their intent seemed clear as they split up to search the island. He had maybe 10 minutes before they found his excavation site, 10 minutes to decide whether to confront them or hide like a rabbit in the underbrush of his own property. The container felt heavier now, not just from its contents, but from the weight of whatever conspiracy he'd stumbled into. Jake Morrison had bought an island for $1. He was beginning to understand that someone else had already paid a much higher price to keep its secrets buried. The question now was whether he'd live long enough to discover what that price had been and who was still willing to pay it. The morning sun cast long shadows across Gull's Rest as Jake stood at the edge of what he'd initially thought was just another rocky outcrop. 3 days of careful excavation had revealed something that made his hands shake as he held his coffee mug. The concrete wasn't random debris from some forgotten construction project. It was deliberate, methodical, and far too sophisticated for anything that should exist on this supposedly worthless piece of land. He'd found the first anomaly while clearing brush for his planned cabin foundation. What looked like natural stone formations were actually carefully camouflaged concrete structures, their surfaces weathered and stained to blend seamlessly with the island's natural geology. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide this place. The metal detector he'd brought to clear the construction site of potential hazards had gone haywire near the eastern shore. Beneath 2 feet of carefully layered soil and native plants, a massive steel door emerged, its surface bearing no identifying marks except for a series of numbers, etched so faintly they were barely visible. November 23, 1962. Jake recognized that date, the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. His construction background told him this wasn't some Cold War bunker thrown together in panic. The engineering was meticulous, expensive, built to last centuries. Whoever had designed this facility had possessed unlimited resources and absolute secrecy. The concrete mixture alone would have cost a fortune. He'd seen similar specifications only in the most classified government contracts he'd worked on during his brief stint with military engineering. But it was the radiation detector's readings that truly unsettled him. Not dangerous levels, but consistent background radiation suggesting this facility had once housed something significant, something that powerful people had wanted buried on an island so remote it didn't even appear on most nautical charts. Jake had spent the previous evening researching Gull's Rest, finding nothing in public records before 1975 when it had mysteriously appeared in government surplus inventories. Before that, the island simply didn't exist in any official capacity. No surveys, no land grants, no historical mentions. It was as if someone had carefully scrubbed its existence from every database and filing cabinet in Washington. The sound of an approaching boat engine snapped him from his thoughts. Jake grabbed his binoculars, scanning the horizon until he spotted a sleek powerboat cutting through the morning swells, heading directly for his island. His nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and the occasional fishing boat never came this close to Gull's Rest's treacherous rocky shoreline. The boat slowed as it approached, and Jake could make out 2 figures aboard. One was operating the vessel with practiced efficiency, while the other held what appeared to be surveying equipment. They weren't tourists or lost fishermen. These men moved with purpose, their attention focused entirely on his island. Jake ducked behind the concrete structure, his mind racing. He'd told exactly 3 people about purchasing Gull's Rest, his sister, his best friend Mike, and his ex-wife, during their bitter phone conversation about his midlife crisis. None of them would have shared that information with anyone who'd send a surveillance team to investigate, unless someone else already knew about the island. Someone who'd been monitoring it, waiting. The boat completed a full circuit around Gull's Rest, staying just outside the rocky shallows that protected the island from casual approach. Through his binoculars, Jake watched the second man methodically photograph every angle of the shoreline, paying particular attention to the areas where Jake had been working. They knew exactly what they were looking for. After 20 minutes, the boat departed as suddenly as it had arrived, but Jake remained hidden until the engine sound faded completely. His hands were trembling as he pulled out his cell phone, surprised to find he had 2 bars of signal, unusual for the island. That's when he noticed the missed calls. 6 of them, all from Mike, starting at dawn. Jake dialed his friend's number with growing dread. "Jesus, Jake." Finally, Mike's voice was tight with worry. "You need to get off that island right now." "What are you talking about?" "Someone came to my office yesterday asking questions about you. Professional types, if you know what I mean. They wanted to know everything about your purchase, what you'd found, whether you'd contacted anyone about the island." I didn't tell them anything, but Jake, these weren't real estate developers or tax assessors. Jake's blood turned to ice. What did they look like? Government suits. The kind that don't smile and don't give last names. They left business cards with just phone numbers, no agency identification. "I've been trying to reach you ever since." As Mike spoke, Jake noticed movement on the horizon. The powerboat was returning, and this time it wasn't alone. 2 additional vessels were approaching from different directions, moving to surround the island. Whatever Jake had uncovered on Gull's Rest, people had died to keep it secret. And now he was trapped on a tiny island with nowhere to run, holding secrets that someone was willing to kill for. The game had begun, and Jake was already 3 moves behind. The salt-crusted dinghy cut through the choppy waters as Jake approached Morrison Island. His island, he reminded himself with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky outcropping that rose from Lake Superior like the spine of some ancient creature. Even in daylight, the place held an ominous quality that made his skin crawl. He'd barely slept after yesterday's discovery. The concrete structure haunted his thoughts, along with questions that multiplied like hydra heads. What was it? Why was it hidden? And why did every instinct scream at him to turn around and pretend he'd never found it? But Jake Morrison wasn't the type to walk away from a mystery, especially one buried on his own property. The boat scraped against the makeshift dock he'd cobbled together from driftwood and rope during his first visit. He secured the line and hefted his expanded toolkit, this time including a proper flashlight, measuring tape, and his old Polaroid camera. If he was going down this rabbit hole, he'd document every step. The island felt different today, more oppressive. The wind carried an odd metallic taste, and the usual chorus of gulls was notably absent. Jake shook off the paranoid thoughts and made his way to the construction site, his boots crunching on the mixture of sand and broken shells. The excavation looked exactly as he'd left it, the mysterious concrete structure partially exposed like a buried coffin. In daylight, he could make out more details. The surface wasn't just concrete, but reinforced with what appeared to be steel mesh. Military-grade construction, if he had to guess. Jake set up his camera and began documenting everything from multiple angles. The flash seemed unnaturally bright in the morning light, each pop making him wince. He measured dimensions, noting that the exposed portion was roughly 8 feet by 4 feet, though it clearly extended much deeper. Using his largest crowbar, he worked to clear more debris from around the edges. The structure was massive, far larger than anything that should exist on a supposedly worthless island. As he dug, his tools struck something that rang like metal, a handle. Jake's heart hammered as he brushed away sand and sediment to reveal a heavy steel wheel, the kind used on submarine doors or bank vaults. Rust had claimed parts of it, but the mechanism looked functional. He photographed it from every conceivable angle before gripping the wheel with both hands. It wouldn't budge. 20 minutes of straining and leverage attempts yielded nothing. The wheel was either rusted solid or locked from the inside. Jake sat back on his heels, wiping sweat despite the cool morning air. Whatever lay beneath had been sealed tight, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to keep it that way. A distant sound made him freeze, the low rumble of an engine carried on the wind. Jake scrambled to the island's highest point and peered across the water. A sleek powerboat was cutting through the waves, heading directly for his position. His blood turned to ice water. The boat wasn't flying any fishing flags, and it was moving with too much purpose to be recreational. Jake had maybe 5 minutes before it arrived. He sprinted back to his excavation, frantically shoving tools into his bag. The photographs went into a waterproof pouch. Whatever happened, he needed to preserve evidence of his discovery. As an afterthought, he grabbed a handful of dirt and debris, carefully covering the steel wheel until it looked like just another pile of excavated earth. The engine noise grew louder. Jake retreated to the tree line, using the sparse vegetation as cover while keeping his dinghy in sight. If he needed to make a run for it, he'd have to time it perfectly. The approaching boat was larger than he'd estimated, a 30-footer with a cabin and what looked like sophisticated navigation equipment. 3 men in dark clothing stood at the bow, scanning the island through binoculars. Even at a distance, Jake could see they weren't tourists. The boat circled the island twice before finding a suitable landing spot on the opposite side from Jake's position. He watched through gaps in the scrub brush as the 3 men disembarked. They moved with military precision, one staying with the boat while the other 2 headed inland. They knew exactly where they were going. Jake's mouth went dry as he watched them walk directly to his excavation site. No searching, no wandering. They made a beeline for the spot where he'd been digging. One of them knelt and began examining the disturbed earth while the other spoke into a radio. Every rational thought told Jake to slip away, to reach his boat and get back to the mainland before they spotted him. But a darker curiosity held him in place. These men were connected to whatever was buried beneath his island, and their presence confirmed his growing suspicion that his dollar auction purchase had been anything but random. As if sensing his thoughts, one of the men looked directly toward his hiding spot. Their eyes met across 50 yards of broken ground, and Jake saw recognition flicker across the stranger's face. Time to run. The silence that followed Jake's revelation hung heavy in the marina office like morning fog. Sarah's eyes remained fixed on the photographs scattered across the desk, while Captain Reed slowly set down his coffee mug with the deliberate care of a man trying not to break something. "You're telling me," Reed finally said, his weathered voice barely above a whisper, "that the Morrison boy found what's been sitting out there for 30 years? Sarah looked up sharply. 30 years? Captain, what exactly do you know about this? Reed's gaze drifted toward the window overlooking the harbor, where Jake's boat bobbed innocently at the dock. More than I ever wanted to. He turned back to them, his face grave. "Jake, that island of yours, it wasn't always uninhabited." Jake felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "Back in '93, there was a research station out there. Small operation, maybe a dozen people. Government funded, real hush-hush stuff. One day they just disappeared." "Disappeared how?" Sarah leaned forward, her journalist instincts fully engaged. "Coast Guard got a distress call, but by the time they reached the island, everyone was gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty buildings and equipment left running." Reed's fingers drummed against the desk. Official report called it an evacuation due to a gas leak. Whole place got bulldozed within a week. Jake's mind raced, connecting dots he didn't want to see. The concrete slabs. They're not natural formations, their foundation remains. "That's my guess." Reed stood and walked to a filing cabinet, withdrawing a manila folder yellow with age. "I kept some newspaper clippings from back then. Call it morbid curiosity." He spread the articles across the desk. Jake scanned the headlines. Research team missing, island facility abandoned, government sites safety concerns. The photographs showed aerial shots of his island, but instead of the overgrown wilderness he knew, they revealed a small compound of white buildings and antenna arrays. "What kind of research?" Sarah asked, photographing the clippings with her phone. "That's where it gets interesting." Reed pulled out a faded photograph. This was taken 2 days before they vanished. "Notice anything unusual?" Jake studied the image. The compound looked normal enough, but in the background, Barely visible against the tree line, he could make out the curved edge of something metallic. His blood turned to ice as he recognized the shape. It matched perfectly with what lay hidden beneath the concrete. "Jesus," he whispered. They were studying it. Before Reed could respond, the office door chimed. All three turned to see a man in a dark suit enter, his movements smooth and purposeful. He was average height with forgettable features, except for his eyes, cold and calculating as they swept the room. "Excuse me," the stranger said, his voice carrying a slight accent Jake couldn't place. "I'm looking for the owner of the vessel's Second Chance. I understand he might be here." Jake's every instinct screamed danger. The man's suit was too expensive, his posture too rigid, and his timing too convenient. "Can I help you?" "Actually, yes." The stranger smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "I represent certain interested parties regarding your recent acquisition. We'd like to make you an offer." Sarah casually moved closer to Jake, while Reed's hand dropped below the desk where Jake suspected he kept something more substantial than office supplies. "What kind of offer?" Jake kept his voice steady. "The kind that would set you up for life. $1 million cash for immediate transfer of your island property. No questions asked, no inspections required." The number hit Jake like a physical blow. $1 million for an island he'd bought for $1. It confirmed his worst fears. Whatever was buried out there was worth killing for. "That's generous," Jake managed. "But I'm not interested in selling." The stranger's smile faltered for just a moment, revealing something predatory underneath. "I think you should reconsider. Islands can be dangerous places. Accidents happen. People get lost." The threat was barely veiled, and Reed stood slowly, his considerable bulk casting a shadow across the desk. "Mister, I think you'd better leave." "Of course." The stranger straightened his tie with deliberate care. "But Mr. Morrison, my employers are very patient. They're also very persistent. We'll be in touch." He turned and walked out as smoothly as he'd entered, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive cologne and menace. Jake's hands were shaking as he gathered the photographs. "We need to call the police." "And tell them what?" Sarah asked. "That someone offered you money for your property? That's not exactly a crime." Reed shook his head grimly. "Those types don't make idle threats. Jake, whatever you found out there, you've kicked a hornet's nest. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Jake looked at the evidence spread before him. 30 years of buried secrets, a research team that vanished without a trace, and now shadowy figures offering fortunes for silence. The smart thing would be to take the money and run. But Jake Morrison had never been accused of being smart. Jake's hands trembled as he held the metal cylinder, its weight far heavier than its size suggested. The underground chamber felt smaller now, pressing in around him as the implications of his discovery crashed down like a collapsing building. Whatever lay inside this container had cost lives and would likely cost more. The beam from his headlamp caught fresh scratches along the cylinder's surface, evidence of recent handling. Someone else had been here, maybe weeks ago, maybe days. The thought sent ice through his veins. If they knew about the chamber, they might know he'd found it. He needed to get out, now. Jake tucked the cylinder inside his jacket and began the treacherous climb back through the tunnel system. Every scrape of his boots against stone echoed like gunshots in the confined space. The walls seemed to pulse with each beat of his racing heart, and twice he had to stop to catch his breath, fighting the claustrophobia that threatened to overwhelm him. When he finally emerged into the fading daylight, the island felt different. What had been his private sanctuary now felt exposed, vulnerable. He scanned the horizon, searching for boats that shouldn't be there, but saw only empty ocean stretching to meet the darkening sky. Back in his trailer, Jake set the cylinder on his small table and stared at it under the harsh LED work light. The metal was some kind of titanium alloy, designed to withstand decades underground without corrosion. Professional grade, military grade. The locking mechanism was unlike anything he'd seen. No visible keyhole or electronic interface, just a series of small indentations around the cap. He traced them with his finger, feeling their precise geometry. They formed a pattern, almost like... His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Stop digging, Mr. Morrison. Some things are better left buried." Jake's blood turned to ice water. He rushed to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. Nothing moved except the wind through the sparse vegetation. But they knew. Somehow they knew. Another text arrived. "Check your email." With shaking hands, Jake opened his laptop. A new message waited, sent from an encrypted address. No subject line, just a single attachment, a video file. He clicked play and watched his own face fill the screen. The timestamp showed earlier that afternoon. The camera angle captured him perfectly as he emerged from the hidden entrance, the cylinder clearly visible in his hands. Someone had been watching, someone with professional equipment and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment. The video ended, replaced by a message in stark white text. "You have 48 hours to return what you've taken. Further instructions will follow. Any attempt to involve authorities or leave the island will result in immediate consequences." Jake slammed the laptop shut, his mind racing. How had they gotten this close without him knowing? His construction experience had taught him to be aware of his surroundings, to notice when things were out of place. Yet they'd been watching him like he was an amateur. He grabbed the cylinder and headed for the door, then stopped. Where could he go? The island was small, maybe 2 square miles of rocky terrain and scrub brush. There was nowhere to hide that they couldn't find him, and the message had been clear: no leaving the island. "Think like an engineer," he told himself. "Every problem has a solution." Jake returned to the table and examined the cylinder more carefully. The pattern of indentations definitely looked familiar. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos he'd taken in the chamber. There, carved into the stone wall above where he'd found the cylinder, the same pattern of small holes arranged in an identical configuration. He'd been so focused on the cylinder itself that he'd missed the obvious. The key wasn't separate from the lock, it was part of the chamber itself. Someone had been clever, ensuring that the container could only be opened in that specific location. But why leave the key at all? Unless... Jake studied the photos more carefully, zooming in on details he'd missed before. Behind the carved pattern, barely visible in the shadows, he could make out additional markings, symbols that looked almost like coordinates. His laptop chimed with another message. This time, it wasn't a threat, it was a live video feed. The camera showed a woman tied to a chair in what looked like a warehouse. She appeared to be in her 50s, professional clothing, obviously terrified. A placard around her neck bore a single word: motivation. Text appeared below the feed. "Dr. Sarah Chen, Geological Survey. She made the same mistake you're making, Mr. Morrison. The difference is, you still have time to avoid her fate." Jake stared at the screen, his earlier fear transforming into something harder, more focused. These people had crossed a line. Whatever was in this cylinder, whatever secret they were protecting, it wasn't worth an innocent woman's life. He grabbed his tools and headed back toward the hidden entrance. If they wanted to play games, he'd show them what happened when you threatened the wrong construction worker. The encrypted files Chen had recovered painted a picture that made Jake's blood run cold. Sitting in the Coast Guard station's briefing room, he watched as aerial photographs from the 1940s filled the laptop screen. Images of his island before nature had reclaimed it. "Project Blackwater," Chen said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was classified above top secret. Even these files were supposed to be destroyed decades ago. The photographs showed a bustling facility where now only ruins remained. Concrete buildings, guard towers, and what appeared to be a massive underground complex with multiple entrance points. Jake recognized the location of his excavation site. It had been the main administrative building. What were they doing there? Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Chen clicked through more files. Biological weapons research. They were developing something called Agent Omega, a weaponized pathogen designed to target specific genetic markers. The project was shut down in 1947 after... She paused, reading. After a containment breach killed everyone on the island. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Commander Hayes leaned forward, studying the screen. That explains the official story about it being a wildlife preserve. They needed to keep people away. But if everyone died and the project was shut down, Jake said, why are people still trying to kill me for finding it? Chen's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up another document. Because they didn't destroy everything. Look at this. The screen showed an inventory list dated 3 days after the supposed shutdown. They removed all the research data and samples, but they left something behind, something they couldn't move. Jake's mouth went dry. The vault I found. According to this, it contains the master cultures, the original biological agents that were the foundation for the entire program. They're sealed in a containment system that was designed to last 50 years. Chen looked up, her face pale. That was 76 years ago. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. If the containment had failed, if he had unknowingly released something into the environment when he breached the vault, we need to get back there, he said, standing abruptly. If those seals are compromised, you're not going anywhere, Hayes interrupted. This is now a matter of national security. I'm calling in a hazmat team. Chen shook her head. You don't understand. Look at these financial records. She pulled up another file. Meridian Corporation has been paying to monitor the island for decades. They know exactly what's there, and they know the containment is failing. That's why they've been so desperate to acquire it quietly. Meridian Corporation? Jake recognized the name. They were one of the largest defense contractors in the country, with their fingers in everything from weapons manufacturing to private military services. They want to restart the program, Chen continued. These emails suggest they've been developing countermeasures, ways to safely extract and weaponize whatever's in that vault. They can't let the government know because the entire project violates international law. Hayes was already reaching for his radio. This is beyond my authorization level. I need to contact... The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a second later, bathing the room in red light, but Jake had already heard what made his heart stop. The sound of boat engines outside growing louder. Multiple engines moving fast. They found us, he whispered. Chen was frantically copying files to a flash drive. The tracking device in your truck, they would have followed the signal here. Hayes drew his sidearm and moved to the window. 3 boats moving in fast, armed personnel. He turned to Jake and Chen. There's a back exit through the equipment bay. My patrol boat is moored at the rear dock. Jake grabbed the laptop while Chen pocketed the flash drive. They could hear voices outside now. Tactical commands being shouted in the darkness. These weren't the same sloppy mercenaries from the island. This was a professional team. Hayes led them through a maze of corridors as the sound of breaking glass echoed from the front of the building. They reached the equipment bay just as floodlights blazed to life outside, turning the Coast Guard station into a fishbowl. "Move!" Hayes commanded, throwing open the rear door. They sprinted across the dock as automatic weapons fire erupted behind them. Jake felt splinters from the wooden planking spray against his legs as bullets chewed through the pier. Hayes's patrol boat was a sleek 30-footer with twin outboards, built for speed. Chen tumbled into the stern while Jake cast off the mooring lines. Hayes was already starting the engines when the first mercenary appeared at the dock's landward end, raising an assault rifle. The boat leaped forward just as muzzle flashes lit up the night. Jake heard the distinctive whine of bullets passing overhead as they raced into the darkness of the harbor. "Where are we going?" Chen shouted over the roar of the engines. Hayes's face was grim in the reflected glow of the instrument panel. "The only place they can't follow us. Back to your island." The marine radio crackled to life as Jake pushed the throttle forward, his borrowed fishing boat cutting through the pre-dawn darkness toward Gull's Rest. Static filled the cabin before a familiar voice broke through. "Morrison, you copy? This is Coast Guard Station Portland." Jake's blood chilled. He recognized Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen's voice, but something was off. The transmission came through on a frequency the Coast Guard rarely used for civilian communications. "I copy," he replied cautiously, keeping his voice steady. We've received reports of suspicious activity in your area, multiple vessels converging on your position. Recommend immediate evacuation to safe harbor. Jake's grip tightened on the wheel. Chen was trying to warn him without alerting whoever might be monitoring standard channels. The fact that she'd reached out at all meant the situation had escalated beyond anything he'd imagined. Understood. Enter to my location. A pause. Negative on assistance. All units committed elsewhere. You're on your own. The transmission cut to static. Jake stared at the radio, processing the implications. The Coast Guard was being kept away deliberately, which meant whoever was hunting him had influence that reached into federal agencies. The island's dark silhouette emerged from the morning mist, and Jake's heart sank. 3 boats were already anchored in the small bay, sleek black vessels that definitely weren't local fishing craft. Powerful spotlights swept across the rocky shore, their beams probing every shadow. Jake killed his engine and let the boat drift, using the morning fog as cover. Through his binoculars, he watched figures in tactical gear moving across his island with military precision. They'd found his excavation site. The ancient stone chamber lay exposed under portable floodlights, and men with metal detectors were systematically scanning every inch of the surrounding area. A larger yacht sat anchored beyond the tactical boats. Even at this distance, Jake could see the expensive lines of its construction, the kind of vessel that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. Someone with serious resources was orchestrating this operation. His satellite phone buzzed with a text from Elena, safe house compromised. They know about Dr. Reeves, going dark, trust no one. Jake deleted the message and powered down the phone. Elena had gotten them this far, but now he was truly alone. He studied the scene on his island, counting at least 8 operatives. They moved with the efficiency of professionals, but they were also systematically destroying his work. One man emerged from the stone chamber, carrying what looked like ancient artifacts in a reinforced case. The sound of another engine made him duck low in his boat. A 4th vessel approached from the north, a Coast Guard cutter running without lights. Jake's initial relief evaporated when he realized it was heading straight for the anchored yacht rather than challenging the obvious illegal activity on the island. Through his binoculars, he watched a figure in a Coast Guard uniform board the yacht. The person's body language suggested familiarity rather than enforcement. Jake's stomach turned as he understood the depth of the conspiracy. The corruption reached into the very agencies meant to protect these waters. A radio transmission from one of the tactical boats drifted across the water, package secured. Initiating site sanitization. Jake watched in horror as the operatives began placing charges around the stone chamber. They weren't just stealing the artifacts, they were erasing all evidence of the discovery. Thousands of years of history would be obliterated to protect whatever secret lay buried in that ancient vault. But Jake had one advantage they didn't know about. During his initial excavation, he'd found a second entrance to the chamber system, hidden beneath a collapsed section of the island's north face. If he could reach it before they finished their demolition, he might salvage something from this disaster. He started his engine and took a wide arc around the island, staying low and using the fog bank to mask his approach. The rocky north shore offered no proper landing, but Jake's construction experience had taught him to improvise. He ran his boat onto a narrow shelf of rock, the hull scraping against stone as he beached it in a small cove. The hidden entrance lay 20 yards up a treacherous cliff face, concealed behind a curtain of sea-weathered stone. Jake had only explored it briefly, but he remembered it connected to the main chamber through a narrow tunnel. If the operatives were focused on the primary excavation site, they might miss this secondary access. He grabbed his emergency kit and started climbing, using handholds he'd mentally mapped during his earlier surveys. Below him, the waves crashed against jagged rocks that would make recovery impossible if he fell. Above, the voices of the tactical team grew clearer as they prepared their demolition. Jake reached the hidden entrance just as the first explosion shook the island. A gout of flame erupted from the main excavation site, followed by the rumble of collapsing stone. But the ancient builders had constructed their sanctuary well. The tunnel Jake crouched in remained intact, and somewhere in the darkness ahead lay secrets that powerful people were willing to kill for. Time was running out, but Jake Morrison wasn't finished yet. The inflatable boat cut through the pre-dawn darkness, its motor barely audible above the lapping waves. Jake gripped the tiller with white knuckles, stealing glances at Sarah hunched beside him. The GPS coordinates Marcus had provided led them to what appeared to be empty ocean, but Jake had learned to trust nothing at face value anymore. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing ahead. A dark mass rose from the water like a sleeping whale. As they drew closer, Jake could make out the distinctive silhouette of a decommissioned oil platform, its skeletal superstructure barely visible against the starlit sky. They'd left Marcus back at the marina with strict instructions to contact the FBI if they didn't return by noon. Jake had wanted to involve law enforcement immediately, but Sarah convinced him they needed concrete evidence first. The files they'd stolen from Meridian's offices painted a picture of corruption that reached into multiple government agencies. The platform's lower deck sat just above the waterline. Jake killed the engine and let momentum carry them to a rusted ladder. Sarah went first, her movements quick and confident, despite the gentle sway of the structure. Jake followed, the metal rungs cold and slippery under his palms. The main deck stretched before them like an industrial graveyard. Abandoned equipment lay scattered about, covered in salt spray and rust. But Jake's construction-trained eye immediately spotted the inconsistencies. Fresh welds on supposedly derelict machinery, new electrical conduits snaking between old pipes, and the subtle hum of generators somewhere below. "This place is still operational," he murmured. Sarah nodded, pulling a small flashlight from her jacket. "The question is, operational for what?" They moved deeper into the platform's maze of corridors and catwalks. Jake's boots echoed hollowly on the metal grating, each step seeming to announce their presence to whoever might be listening. The air tasted of brine and diesel fuel, with an underlying chemical tang that made his nose burn. A sound stopped them cold, voices drifting from somewhere ahead. Jake grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her behind a massive pump housing. Two men in coveralls walked past, their conversation carrying clearly in the still air. "Next shipment comes in Thursday. Boss wants the new batch processed and ready for transport by weekend. What about the Morrison problem?" "Handled. Teams moving on his position at first light." Jake's blood turned to ice. They knew where he was, or thought they did. Thank God he'd insisted on the decoy plan with Marcus. But it meant their window was closing fast. The men's footsteps faded, and Jake motioned for Sarah to follow. They climbed a narrow staircase to an upper level, where a row of offices had been built into the platform's superstructure. Most were dark, but yellow light spilled from beneath one door. Jake pressed his ear to the metal. Inside, he could hear the rapid clicking of keyboard keys and the occasional rustle of papers. He tested the door handle. Locked, but the mechanism looked standard. Sarah produced a set of lockpicks from her jacket with a grim smile. "Journalist's toolkit," she whispered. "Don't ask." The lock yielded after 30 seconds of careful manipulation. Jake eased the door open to reveal a compact office lined with monitors and filing cabinets. Charts and maps covered one wall, with his island prominently marked at the center of what looked like shipping routes. Red lines connected it to locations across the Gulf Coast. But it was the desk that made Jake's stomach lurch. Spread across its surface were his architectural drawings, the ones he'd submitted to the county for his resort permits, but modified. Where his plans showed guest bungalows, someone had sketched in what looked like processing facilities. Storage areas had been relocated and expanded. The entire island had been redesigned as some kind of industrial complex. Sarah photographed everything with her phone while Jake rifled through the filing cabinets. He found shipping manifests, chemical supply orders, and payment records that made his head spin. Meridian Corporation was part of a larger network: Apex Industries, Coastal Holdings, Gulf Maritime Services, shell companies within shell companies, all funneling money toward a single purpose. "Jake!" Sarah's voice was tight with urgency. "Look at this." She'd found a shipping schedule posted behind the desk. According to the dates, a vessel called the Artemis was due to arrive at his island in less than 18 hours. The cargo manifest was coded, but the tonnage suggested something substantial. Footsteps rang on the metal stairs outside. Jake quickly photographed the remaining documents, while Sarah gathered the architectural plans. They were nearly finished, when voices echoed in the corridor, closer this time, and heading their way. Jake killed his flashlight and moved to the small window. The drop to the deck below looked survivable, barely. Behind them, the voices grew louder. Someone was checking doors, getting closer with each passing second. Sarah stuffed the last of the plans into her jacket and joined him at the window. "Together," she whispered. The door handle rattled as Jake pushed the window open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the taste of freedom and the promise of pursuit. The pre-dawn darkness provided perfect cover as Jake guided his small motorboat through the choppy waters toward Gull Island. Sarah crouched beside him, her laptop secured in a waterproof case, while Marcus checked his diving equipment one final time. The ocean spray stung Jake's face, but adrenaline kept him focused on the shadowy outline of his island, growing larger against the starlit horizon. "Remember, we have maybe 6 hours before Chen's people realize we're gone," Sarah whispered over the engine noise. "The GPS tracker I planted on their surveillance van shows they're still parked outside my apartment building." Jake cut the engine as they approached the rocky shore on the island's eastern side, away from the main dock where Chen's men might be watching. The boat scraped against barnacle-covered stones as Marcus jumped out to secure the bowline. "The entrance to the underground facility should be somewhere near the old foundation," Jake said, shouldering his pack filled with explosives and excavation tools. "I've been thinking about those blueprints we found. The depth calculations don't match the current ground level." They moved inland through dense scrub brush, Jake leading them toward the concrete ruins he'd first discovered weeks ago. Everything had changed since then. What started as a simple construction assessment had become a deadly game of cat and mouse with forces he still didn't fully understand. The foundation looked different in the moonlight, more ominous somehow. Jake knelt beside the largest concrete slab and ran his hands along its edges, feeling for irregularities. His construction experience told him something was wrong with the way this concrete had been poured. "Here," he whispered, finding a section where the concrete felt hollow underneath. "Marcus, can you help me move some of this debris?" Working together, they cleared away decades of accumulated dirt and vegetation. Beneath the surface layer, Jake's fingers found what he was looking for, a metal access panel, corroded but still intact. Sarah kept watch while the two men worked to pry open the panel. The metal groaned in protest before finally giving way, revealing a narrow shaft descending into darkness. A rush of stale air carried the scent of rust and something else, something chemical. "This is it," Jake breathed. "This is what they've been trying to hide." Marcus lowered a waterproof flashlight into the opening. The beam revealed a metal ladder descending at least 20 feet into what appeared to be a concrete-lined tunnel. "I'm going down first," Jake said, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "We stay together. If something happens down there, we need to be able to help each other." The descent felt like entering another world. Jake's boots rang against the metal rungs as he climbed down, followed by Sarah and then Marcus. The tunnel at the bottom stretched in both directions, with overhead pipes and electrical conduits that looked far more sophisticated than anything that should exist on his supposedly worthless island. They followed the main corridor, their flashlight beams revealing doors marked with faded government seals and radiation warning symbols. Jake's stomach tightened as he realized what they'd stumbled into. "This isn't just a weapons facility," Sarah whispered, photographing everything with her camera. "Look at these markings. This was a biological research installation." Behind the first door they managed to open, they found laboratories filled with equipment that had been abandoned in apparent haste. Broken glass containers lined the shelves, and papers scattered across workbenches bore the letterhead of a defense contractor Jake had never heard of. Marcus picked up a clipboard from one of the lab benches. "Project Nightshade," he read aloud. "Phase 3 trials completed. Recommend immediate termination of all test subjects." The words sent a chill through Jake. Whatever had happened here 40 years ago, people had died to keep it secret. And now Chen's organization was willing to kill again to claim whatever remained. A distant sound echoed through the tunnels, the unmistakable hum of boat engines approaching the island. "They found us," Sarah said, her face pale in the flashlight's glow. Jake's mind raced through their options. The tunnel system might have other exits, but they didn't know the layout well enough to navigate in the dark while being pursued. Their best hope was to gather as much evidence as possible before making their escape. 30 minutes, he decided. We document everything we can, then get out through the drainage tunnels that should connect to the shore. They split up, moving through different sections of the facility with desperate efficiency. Jake found storage rooms filled with sealed containers, their contents unknown but clearly dangerous enough to warrant extensive warning labels. Sarah discovered computer terminals that might still contain recoverable data. Marcus located what appeared to be a small armory, its weapons long since removed but ammunition still scattered across the floor. The sound of voices above ground grew closer, accompanied by the systematic search pattern of multiple flashlights sweeping the island's surface. Chen's people were thorough, and it wouldn't be long before they found the hidden entrance. Jake gathered his companions with a sharp whistle. Time was running out, and their real fight was just beginning. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the dawn air like a chainsaw through silence. Jake pressed himself deeper into the rocky outcropping, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the black aircraft circle his island like a vulture. The pilot was methodical, searching every cove and inlet where a small boat might hide. Sarah squeezed his arm, her knuckles white against his jacket. "They found us faster than we expected." Jake nodded grimly. They'd made it back to the island just before sunrise, using the cover of darkness to navigate the treacherous waters around the northern shore. The documents they'd retrieved from Henderson's safe were now sealed in waterproof containers, hidden in 3 separate locations across the island. If something happened to them, at least the evidence would survive. There, Marcus pointed toward the helicopter as it began its descent toward the main dock. "They're landing!" Through his binoculars, Jake watched 6 figures emerge from the aircraft. Even at this distance, he recognized the purposeful movements of trained operatives. These weren't construction workers or government inspectors. These were the people who'd killed Senator Morrison, Henderson, and God knew how many others to protect whatever lay beneath his island. "We need to reach the main excavation site," Jake whispered. "If we can document what's down there, broadcast it somehow." "With what?" Sarah interrupted. "They'll have jamming equipment. Our phones are useless out here anyway." Marcus was studying the documents they'd photographed on Henderson's desk. "According to this, there's an emergency communication array installed somewhere on the island. Military grade. It was part of the original construction in 1962. Jake's mind raced. The construction records he'd studied showed several unexplained concrete pours near the island's center, areas that hadn't made sense for a simple research facility. The old generator building. It's too big for what it should contain. The helicopter's rotors wound down, leaving an ominous silence broken only by the crash of waves against the rocks below. Jake could see the operatives spreading out, beginning a systematic search of the island's structures. They had maybe 20 minutes before the search reached their position. Moving in single file, they descended from the rocky outcrop through a maze of scrub brush and fallen trees. The island's terrain worked in their favor here. Decades of storms had created a natural obstacle course that would slow any pursuit. Jake led them along a deer path he discovered during his first week of exploration, a route that stayed below the ridgeline and out of sight from the main compound. The old generator building squatted like a concrete bunker amid a grove of wind-twisted pines. Jake had only examined it briefly before, noting the unusually thick walls and the heavy-duty electrical conduits that seemed excessive for a simple backup power system. Now, with Henderson's documents providing context, everything made terrible sense. Sarah kept watch while Jake and Marcus examined the building's exterior. The main entrance was sealed with a lock that looked newer than the rest of the structure, but Jake's construction experience had taught him to look for alternative access points. He found what he was seeking on the building's north side, a maintenance hatch partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. The hatch opened onto a ladder leading down into darkness. Jake switched on his flashlight and descended first, his boots echoing against metal rungs. The space below was larger than the building's footprint suggested, extending deep into the bedrock beneath the island. "Jesus Christ!" Marcus breathed as he joined Jake at the bottom of the ladder. The underground chamber stretched out before them like a cathedral of secrets. Banks of electronic equipment lined the walls, most of it dark and dormant but clearly maintained. At the chamber's center sat a communication array that belonged in a military command center, not on a supposedly abandoned research island. But it was the far wall that made Jake's blood run cold. A massive map covered the entire surface, marked with red dots scattered across major cities worldwide. Each dot was labeled with coordinates, dates, and what appeared to be operational codes. Many of the dates were in the past, corresponding, Jake realized with growing horror, to incidents he remembered from news reports over the years. Terrorist attacks, political assassinations, infrastructure failures that had been blamed on foreign actors or domestic extremists. Sarah dropped down into the chamber just as footsteps echoed from somewhere above. The operatives had reached the generator building. "Get that communication array online," Jake whispered urgently, moving toward the map wall. "We need to document everything." Marcus's fingers flew over the equipment controls while Sarah photographed the wall map with a small camera she'd brought from Henderson's office. Jake studied the map more closely, his construction engineer's mind automatically analyzing the patterns and connections. The footsteps above grew louder, more purposeful. Someone was examining the building's exterior, looking for exactly what they'd found. "Got it," Marcus hissed. The communication array hummed to life, banks of lights flickering across its control surface. "But I need a destination frequency." Jake pulled out the business card Elena Morrison had given him, the one with her private investigator contacts information. On the back, written in her careful handwriting, was a number she'd said to use only in absolute emergency. This qualified. The speedboat's engine screamed across the dark water, its bow cutting through waves that splashed cold spray across Jake's face. Behind them, searchlights swept the harbor like angry fingers, and the distant rumble of pursuit boats grew louder with each passing second. "There!" Sarah shouted over the wind, pointing toward a cluster of fishing vessels anchored near the mainland dock. "We can lose them in the fleet." Jake yanked the wheel hard to starboard, feeling the boat's hull skip across the choppy surface. His shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed him during their escape from the island, but adrenaline kept the pain manageable. The waterproof case containing the documents sat wedged between his feet, their only proof of the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. The searchlights found them just as they reached the fishing fleet. Brilliant white beams illuminated their wake, and Jake heard the sharp crack of rifle fire. A bullet punched through the fiberglass hull, inches from his hand. "Down!" he yelled, pushing Sarah toward the deck as he wove between the anchored boats. The larger vessels provided momentary cover, their hulls blocking the searchlights as Jake navigated the maze of anchor lines and nets. A massive trawler loomed ahead, its rusted sides rising like a wall from the black water. Jake cut the engine and let momentum carry them alongside, grabbing a hanging rope ladder as they drifted past. The boat bumped against the trawler's hull with a hollow thud. "Up!" he whispered, helping Sarah onto the ladder. They climbed quickly, the metal rungs cold and slippery under their hands. Behind them, the pursuit boat's engines grew thunderous as they approached the fleet. The trawler's deck was cluttered with nets and equipment, casting strange shadows in the moonlight. Jake pulled Sarah behind a pile of crab traps just as the first pursuit boat rounded the stern, its searchlight sweeping across the water where their speedboat now drifted empty. "Where did they go?" a voice called from below. Jake recognized the clipped accent of Colonel Reeves, the man who'd been orchestrating the hunt from the beginning. "They have to be here somewhere," another voice replied. "Check every boat." Jake's mind raced. The documents in the waterproof case contained financial records linking Reeves and his organization to illegal weapons sales, human trafficking, and worse. But evidence was worthless if they didn't survive to deliver it. He tapped Sarah's shoulder and pointed toward the trawler's wheelhouse. They crept across the deck, staying low as searchlights continued to sweep the area. The wheelhouse door was unlocked, and they slipped inside just as boots clanged on the ladder below. The small cabin smelled of diesel fuel and old coffee. Jake found what he was looking for behind the captain's chair, a marine radio. He switched it to the emergency frequency and grabbed the microphone. "Mayday, Mayday," he whispered. "This is Jake Morrison calling any federal authorities. We have evidence of a criminal conspiracy and are under attack near Millfield Harbor. Repeat, we need immediate assistance." Static crackled for a moment. Then a professional voice responded. "This is Coast Guard Station Portland. We copy your mayday. What is your exact location?" Before Jake could answer, the wheelhouse door exploded inward. Colonel Reeves stood silhouetted against the moonlight, his weapon trained on Jake's chest. "Step away from the radio," Reeves commanded. His uniform was rumpled, and there was a wild look in his eyes that suggested a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." Jake raised his hands slowly, the microphone still clutched in his right palm. "I know enough. The arms deals, the missing persons, the bodies buried on my island, all connected to your operation." Reeves laughed bitterly. "Your island? That rock has been our facility for 15 years. You think a dollar purchase at some government auction gives you ownership? Those sales were fake, designed to keep people away while we conducted necessary operations." "Necessary?" Sarah spoke for the first time, her voice shaking with anger. "You murdered families, children." "Casualties of a larger mission," Reeves said coldly. "We were building something important, a network that could have changed everything. And you've destroyed it all for what? Some misguided sense of justice?" The radio crackled again. "Millfield Harbor, this is Coast Guard Cutter Vigilant. We're en route to your position. Estimate 10 minutes. Reeves's expression darkened. He raised his weapon higher, finger tightening on the trigger. 10 minutes too late. Jake dove sideways as the gun fired, pulling Sarah down with him. The bullet shattered the radio in a shower of sparks. They hit the deck hard, rolling behind the captain's chair as Reeves advanced into the cabin. Outside, shouts erupted across the harbor as the gunshot echoed between the boats. Jake heard running footsteps and more voices, some of Reeves's men, but also others. The fishing crews were waking up. "Last chance," Reeves said, moving closer. "Give me those documents and I might let you swim to shore." Jake's hand closed around a heavy wrench lying beside the chair. It wasn't much against a gun, but it was all they had. The helicopter's rotors chopped through the dawn air as Jake pressed himself against the rocky outcropping, watching the aircraft circle his island like a mechanical vulture. Sarah's hand found his shoulder, her grip tight with tension. 3 passes in the last 10 minutes, she whispered. "They're looking for landing spots." Jake's mind raced through their dwindling options. The emergency shelter he'd built near the island's center would buy them time, but not much. The real problem was the briefcase full of documents they'd pulled from the underground facility, evidence that connected Senator Morrison and his consortium to decades of illegal weapons testing and environmental cover-ups. "We need to get to the radio equipment," Jake said, eyeing the path back to his construction trailer. "If I can reach the Coast Guard frequency." The sharp crack of a rifle cut through the morning air, sending chips of granite exploding inches from Jake's head. Sarah yanked him backward as more shots peppered their hiding spot. "So much for the radio," she muttered, pulling her service weapon. "They've got shooters on the ground already." Jake's construction experience kicked in, his mind automatically mapping the island's terrain. The limestone caves he'd discovered during excavation ran deeper than he'd initially explored. If they could reach the entrance near the old dock, those tunnels might offer both protection and an alternate route to the hidden weapons cache. "This way," he said, leading Sarah along a narrow ledge that skirted the island's eastern shore. The helicopter had moved to hover over the island's center, rappelling ropes visible beneath its belly. Jake counted at least 4 figures descending. They reached the cave entrance just as voices echoed from the ridge above. Jake recognized the clipped military cadence of professional soldiers. This wasn't some hastily assembled crew. These were the same people who'd been cleaning up Senator Morrison's messes for years. Inside the cave, their flashlights carved pale tunnels through the darkness. The air was cool and damp, carrying the mineral scent of deep earth. Jake led them deeper, following passages he'd mapped during his initial survey work. "Jake," Sarah's voice was sharp with concern. "Look at this." Her light illuminated a section of wall where the natural limestone gave way to poured concrete. Military stenciling was still visible beneath decades of moisture stains, classified Project Deepwatch, 1962. "Jesus," Jake breathed. "This goes back to the Cold War." Sarah ran her fingers along the concrete edge. "Your uncle wasn't just covering up recent activity. This whole island was a government black site." The sound of boots on stone echoed from the cave entrance behind them. Jake grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her deeper into the tunnel system. His mental map suggested these passages connected to the underground facility, but he wasn't certain which turns led to escape routes versus dead ends. They emerged into a circular chamber Jake didn't recognize from his previous explorations. Emergency lighting flickered to life as they entered, revealing walls lined with filing cabinets and computer terminals that looked decades old. The air was stale but breathable, suggesting active ventilation systems. "Motion sensors," Sarah observed, noting the blinking lights on the ceiling. "Someone's been maintaining this place." Jake moved to the nearest computer terminal, surprised when the screen hummed to life at his touch. The interface was crude but functional, displaying directory after directory of classified files. Project names scrolled past that made his blood run cold: Deepwatch, Silent Shore, Prometheus Chain. "Download what you can," Sarah urged, watching the chamber entrance. "I'll watch for—" The lights went out. Emergency strips along the floor cast an eerie red glow as a voice boomed through hidden speakers. "Mr. Morrison, Miss Chen, you've seen enough." Jake's fingers flew over the keyboard in the red darkness, copying files to a portable drive. The voice was familiar. Senator Morrison's chief of staff, the man who'd first approached him about selling the island. "Your uncle understood the importance of national security," the voice continued. "These facilities served their country during the darkest days of the Cold War. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Sarah's weapon was trained on the chamber entrance, but no figures appeared. "They're trying to flush us out," she said quietly. The computer finished its transfer just as new sounds echoed through the tunnels, the distinctive hiss of gas being released. Jake pocketed the drive and grabbed an emergency respirator from the wall mount. "Chemical dispersal," Sarah coughed, covering her nose. "We need another exit." Jake's eyes swept the chamber, his contractor's instincts noting the air circulation patterns. The ventilation system had to connect to the surface somewhere, and the strongest airflow seemed to come from a grate near the far wall. As the gas thickened around them, Jake realized they had perhaps minutes before unconsciousness. But the portable drive in his pocket contained enough evidence to bring down not just Senator Morrison, but an entire network of government officials who'd turned his family's island into their personal dumping ground for dirty secrets. The question was whether they'd live long enough to expose it. Jake's hands trembled as he gripped the waterproof case containing the documents. The speedboat's engine roared beneath him, salt spray stinging his face as Marcus pushed the craft to its limits through the choppy waters. Behind them, 2 black boats emerged from the harbor, their powerful engines gaining ground with terrifying efficiency. "They're faster than us," Sarah shouted over the wind, her voice barely audible above the chaos. Marcus didn't respond, his jaw set in grim determination as he yanked the wheel hard to starboard. The boat skipped across a wave, momentarily airborne, before crashing back down with bone-jarring force. Jake clutched the case tighter, knowing that everything they'd fought for, everything people had died for, was contained within those yellowed pages. The documents told a story that stretched back decades, a web of corruption involving Senator Reynolds, defense contractors, and foreign governments. Jake had only managed to scan a few pages before they'd been forced to flee, but what he'd seen was enough to understand why Blackwater would kill to keep it buried. Arms deals, illegal weapons testing, offshore accounts, all of it documented in meticulous detail. "There," Sarah pointed toward a cluster of rocky outcroppings jutting from the water like broken teeth. "The sea caves. We can lose them in there." Marcus shook his head. "Too dangerous in this weather. One wrong turn and we'll be fish food." A sharp crack split the air, and a chunk of fiberglass exploded from the boat's hull near Jake's feet. Someone was shooting at them. "Change of plans," Marcus growled, spinning the wheel toward the caves. The pursuing boats had split up, one following their path while the other curved wide, attempting to cut off their escape route. Jake could see armed figures in black tactical gear aboard both vessels, their weapons trained on his boat. As they approached the caves, the water grew choppier, waves crashing against the jagged rocks with thunderous force. Marcus had to slow their speed, navigating carefully between the treacherous stone pillars. The cave mouth yawned ahead of them, a dark maw that promised either salvation or destruction. "Hold on!" Marcus shouted. They plunged into the darkness, the boat's spotlight cutting through the gloom to reveal a narrow channel winding deeper into the rock formation. Behind them, Jake could hear the pursuing boats hesitating at the cave entrance, their pilots clearly weighing the risks. The decision was made for them when Senator Reynolds's voice crackled over a loudspeaker. "Follow them. We can't let them reach the mainland with those documents." Jake's blood chilled. Reynolds was here, personally overseeing the operation. That meant the stakes were even higher than he'd imagined. The cave system was a maze of interconnected chambers and passages, carved by centuries of tidal action. Marcus navigated by instinct and the weak beam of their spotlight, the boat's engine echoing eerily off the stone walls. Water dripped from stalactites overhead, and Jake could smell the musty dampness of the enclosed space. "There's another exit," Sarah said, consulting her phone's GPS. "About half a mile ahead, it comes out near Seal Point." A grinding crash behind them indicated that at least one of their pursuers had encountered the cave's less forgiving aspects, but engines still echoed through the tunnels, growing closer. As they rounded a tight corner, their spotlight illuminated something that made Jake's heart sink. The passage ahead was blocked by a recent rockfall, massive boulders creating an impenetrable barrier. "Dead end," Marcus muttered, cutting the engine. The sound of approaching boats grew louder. In the sudden quiet, Jake could hear voices echoing off the cave walls, tactical communications coordinating their capture. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered. Jake stared at the waterproof case in his hands, then at his companions. These people had risked everything to help him, and now they were all going to die because of his stubbornness. He'd bought that island on a whim, driven by some foolish notion of adventure, and it had led them all into this nightmare. But as the voices grew closer, something hardened inside him. He thought of Elena, gunned down simply for trying to help. He thought of the corruption documented in these papers, the lives destroyed by the greed of powerful men who believed themselves above the law. "No," he said quietly, then louder, "No, we're not done yet." He pulled out his phone and activated the satellite transmitter he'd been saving for emergencies. The device would broadcast their location to every maritime authority within range, along with a pre-recorded message he'd prepared explaining their situation. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. "Calling for backup," Jake replied, then began uploading photos of the documents to every news outlet and government agency he could think of. If we're going down, we're taking Reynolds with us. The sound of engines was very close now. Tactical lights began to probe the water ahead, searching for their hiding spot behind a cluster of fallen rocks. Jake finished the uploads just as the first black boat rounded the corner. The helicopter blades chopped through the morning air as Jake pressed himself against the cold metal floor, watching the mainland shrink below. Dr. Chen sat across from him, clutching a waterproof case containing copies of every document they'd found in the facility. The pilot, a grizzled former Navy man named Torres, whom Marcus had somehow procured on 12 hours' notice, kept glancing at his instruments with obvious concern. "We've got company," Torres called back, his voice barely audible over the rotor noise. "Two birds, coming up fast from the southeast." Jake twisted to look out the small window. Two black helicopters were gaining on them, sleek and predatory against the grey sky. No markings, no identification numbers visible. "Can we outrun them?" Jake shouted. Torres shook his head grimly. "Military grade. They'll catch us before we reach the coast." The radio crackled to life. A cold, professional voice filled the cabin. "Unidentified aircraft. You are in restricted airspace. Land immediately, or we will be forced to take action." "What restricted airspace?" Torres muttered, then keyed his mic. "This is civilian flight November 74 Delta, following filed flight plan to Boston, requesting clarification on restriction." The response was immediate and chilling. "Land now or be shot down." Chen's face had gone pale. "They're not going to let us reach the mainland." Jake's mind raced. The documents in Chen's case contained enough evidence to expose decades of illegal experiments, human trafficking, and murder, but only if they survived long enough to deliver them. He thought of Sarah, probably already in federal custody, and Marcus, whose fate remained unknown since his communications had gone dark 6 hours ago. "Torres, how far are we from that small airstrip on Beacon Island?" "Maybe 8 minutes." "Why?" "I know someone there." "Emergency landing?" Torres nodded, already banking the helicopter toward the northeast. The pursuing aircraft adjusted course immediately, closing the distance. Jake could see armed figures in tactical gear through their open doors. The radio crackled again. "Final warning. Land immediately." "They're powering up weapons systems," Torres said, his knuckles white on the controls. "Whatever you found on that island, somebody really doesn't want it getting out." Beacon Island appeared ahead, a small fishing community with a single dirt runway. Jake had done some construction work there 2 summers ago, helping rebuild the dock after a storm. He remembered the island's sheriff, a tough woman named Rodriguez, who'd grown up in Boston and had no love for federal overreach. Torres brought the helicopter down hard on the runway, kicking up clouds of dust. "Go, go, go!" Jake and Chen tumbled out. The case clutched between them. The pursuing helicopters were circling now, setting up to land. Jake spotted Rodriguez's patrol car racing toward them from the small town. "This way!" Jake grabbed Chen's arm, pulling her toward a cluster of weathered buildings near the dock. If they could reach the marina, maybe they could find a boat fast enough to... The first shots cracked over their heads. Not meant to kill, Jake realized, but to stop them from running. The tactical teams were rappelling down now, moving with military precision. Rodriguez's car skidded to a halt between Jake and the approaching soldiers. The sheriff emerged with her shotgun drawn, her badge catching the morning light. "This is Beacon Island jurisdiction," she called out. "State your business and authority." A figure in black tactical gear approached, his face hidden behind a helmet and visor. "Federal operation. Stand down." "Show me a warrant," Rodriguez replied coolly. Jake used the distraction to pull Chen behind a stack of lobster traps. His phone had 1 bar of signal. Frantically, he texted the contact information Marcus had given him for a journalist at the Washington Post, along with a brief message, "Check your email in 10 minutes. Life or death." Chen was already uploading the documents to a cloud server, her fingers flying over her tablet. "Almost done," she whispered. The standoff between Rodriguez and the tactical team was escalating. More voices, more weapons being drawn. Jake realized the sheriff was buying them time she probably didn't have. "Upload complete," Chen said. "Multiple servers, multiple journalists, backup sites." Jake felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by terror as he saw armed figures flanking their position. They'd been spotted. Jake stood slowly, hands visible. "You mean the evidence of your illegal experiments? The records of people you murdered? Those are classified materials related to national security." "Funny thing about the truth," Jake said, stepping into the open. "Once it's out there, you can't stuff it back in the box." The tactical leader's radio crackled. Someone was speaking urgently, though Jake couldn't make out the words. The man's posture changed, tension radiating through his gear. "Sir," one of his team members called out, "we're getting reports of story breaking online. Multiple outlets." The leader's weapon lowered slightly. Around the small group, Jake could see uncertainty rippling through the tactical team. Their mission had just shifted from recovery to damage control. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Jake pressed himself deeper into the rocky crevice. Sarah's breathing was rapid beside him, her laptop clutched protectively against her chest. The searchlight swept across the cave entrance for the third time in 10 minutes, its harsh beam turning the darkness into a strobe of terror. "They know we're here," Sarah whispered. Jake peered around the edge of their hiding spot. Through the cave opening, he could see the helicopter hovering 50 feet above the island's surface. 2 more boats had joined the first, their spotlights creating an interlocking web of light that made escape seem impossible. "Maybe," Jake said, his mind racing, "or maybe they're just being thorough." The documents Sarah had decoded painted a picture more disturbing than either of them had imagined. The island wasn't just a cover-up site for a military accident. It was ground zero for something far more sinister. Project Blackwater had been using the remote location to develop biological weapons, substances so dangerous that when the program was officially terminated in 1987, they'd simply buried everything rather than risk transporting it. But the burial hadn't been complete. Someone had been coming back, year after year, slowly extracting the most valuable components. The government auction hadn't been incompetence. It had been a deliberate attempt to transfer ownership to a shell company that would continue the extraction under private cover. Jake's unexpected winning bid had shattered decades of careful planning. "The thermal imaging," Sarah said suddenly. "They're not searching randomly. They're tracking our heat signatures." Jake looked at the cave's deeper recesses. He'd explored maybe a quarter of the tunnel system during his initial surveys. There had to be other ways out, passages that led to different parts of the island. But moving deeper meant leaving their only known exit behind. The sound of boots on rocks echoed from outside. Flashlight beams began probing the cave entrance. "Dr. Morrison?" The voice was cultured, professional. "Dr. Chen, there's no need to make this difficult. We simply want to talk." Jake recognized the voice. Richardson, the man who'd been following them since Seattle, the same man whose organization had orchestrated the auction scam. "Your discovery is remarkable," Richardson continued, his voice growing closer. "But you've stumbled into something beyond your understanding, something that affects national security." Sarah grabbed Jake's arm, pointing deeper into the cave. He nodded, and they began moving carefully through the darkness, using his phone's flashlight on its dimmest setting. The cave floor was uneven, covered with decades of debris that had washed in during storms. Behind them, Richardson's voice echoed off the walls. "The biological agents buried here aren't just dangerous. They're revolutionary. In the wrong hands, they could destabilize entire regions." "We're not the villains here, Dr. Morrison. We're trying to prevent a catastrophe." The tunnel branched ahead of them. Jake chose the path that seemed to angle upward, hoping it would lead to another surface opening. The air was getting fresher, which he took as a good sign. "Revolutionary how?" Sarah whispered as they climbed. "According to those documents, they were developing targeted pathogens, biological weapons that could be programmed to affect specific genetic markers. Jake's construction background had taught him to read technical specifications, and what he'd seen in those files had chilled him. Population-specific weapons. Sarah stopped walking. "That's not possible. The science doesn't—" She paused, her face pale in the phone's glow. Actually, with modern gene editing techniques, a new sound reached them from behind. Barking. They'd brought dogs. Jake broke into a run, pulling Sarah with him. The tunnel was widening, and he could smell salt air more strongly now. Somewhere ahead was another way out. They emerged onto a narrow ledge on the island's north face, 50 feet above the churning water. The boats were all positioned on the southern approaches. This side was clear, but there was nowhere to go except down into the rocks and surf. "Can you swim in those?" Jake asked, gesturing at Sarah's business clothes. "Can you survive what they'll do to us if we don't try?" Fair point. Jake pulled out his phone and activated the emergency beacon he'd installed after buying the island, a direct line to the Coast Guard. But even if they responded immediately, it would be 20 minutes before help arrived. The barking was getting closer. Richardson's voice called out from inside the tunnel, "Dr. Morrison, you're making a serious mistake. The people I represent aren't the only ones interested in what you've found. There are others, foreign actors who won't be as reasonable as we are." Jake looked at Sarah, then at the water below. The rocks were jagged, the currents unpredictable, but staying meant capture, and he'd seen enough in those documents to know that Richardson's people didn't leave loose ends. "Together," he said, taking Sarah's hand. They jumped. The helicopter's rotors cut through the pre-dawn darkness as Jake gripped the metal briefcase containing the evidence that could bring down Senator Hartwell's entire operation. Below them, Raven's Nest Island grew smaller, but Jake knew their troubles were far from over. Sarah checked her encrypted phone for the third time in 10 minutes. "Still no signal," she muttered, her face pale in the cockpit's green glow. "We need to reach the FBI field office before Hartwell's people realize what we've taken." Agent Torres adjusted his headset, speaking directly to the pilot. "Any other aircraft on radar?" "Negative, but that could change fast. These modified birds Hartwell's been using don't show up on civilian radar." The pilot's knuckles were white on the controls. "ETA to Portland is 40 minutes if we push it." Jake's mind raced through everything they'd discovered in the underground facility. The weapons cache was just the beginning. The real bombshell was the detailed records of arms deals stretching back 15 years, each transaction bearing Hartwell's digital signature, enough evidence to implicate half the defense contractors on the East Coast and several foreign governments. There, Sarah pointed through the windscreen at distant lights approaching from the northeast. 3 helicopters, moving fast. Torres grabbed his radio. "Mayday, mayday. Federal agents under pursuit by hostile aircraft, requesting immediate assistance." "Castellanos is dirty," Torres said grimly, switching off the radio. "We're on our own." The pilot banked sharply left as tracer rounds lit up the sky beside them. "They're not trying to bring us down. They want us alive. That briefcase must be worth more than our lives combined." Jake clutched the case tighter. "How long until we reach the mainland?" 20 minutes to the coast, but they'll intercept us in 5. Sarah was already moving, checking weapons and equipment. "There, that oil platform at 2 o'clock. Can you set us down?" "Are you insane? That's a 40-foot drop into freezing water if we miss." Better odds than facing Hartwell's cleanup crew. Jake was surprised by his own calm. 3 weeks ago, his biggest worry had been meeting construction deadlines. The pursuing helicopters spread out in attack formation. Through the darkness, Jake could see figures rappelling from the lead aircraft onto a nearby supply vessel. They were coordinating a water-based intercept. "Platform it is." The pilot dove toward the industrial structure, its lights creating a beacon in the black ocean. 60 seconds! Torres handed Jake a waterproof bag. "Seal that case inside. If this goes wrong, you're the only one without law enforcement training. You run, you hide, and you get that evidence to the media." "I'm not leaving you." "That's an order, Morrison." The helicopter shuddered as it took fire from their pursuers. Through the rear window, Jake watched one of Hartwell's aircraft attempting to force them toward the waiting vessel below. The senator's reach was longer than any of them had imagined. 30 seconds. Everyone hold on. The oil platform rushed up to meet them, its landing pad barely large enough for their aircraft. The pilot fought crosswinds while evading the hostile helicopters that had closed to within a few hundred yards. "Now!" Torres shouted. They touched down hard, the skids scraping against the platform's metal grating. Jake rolled out first, clutching the sealed evidence bag, followed by Sarah and Torres. The pilot kept the rotors spinning. "Go. I'll try to draw them off." The helicopter lifted away immediately, banking toward the mainland as Hartwell's aircraft followed. But Jake noticed one had broken off, circling back toward the platform. "Service ladder, north side." Sarah pointed across the platform's maze of pipes and equipment. They ran through the industrial landscape as the remaining pursuit helicopter hovered overhead, searchlights cutting through the darkness. Platform workers scattered, shouting in confusion. Jake reached the ladder first, looking down at the 60-foot drop to a maintenance boat bobbing in the swells below. "Please tell me one of you can pilot that thing." "Coast Guard training," Torres said. "But we've got company." Armed figures fast-roped onto the platform behind them, their tactical gear and weapons making their intentions clear. These weren't federal agents. They moved with military precision that spoke of private contractors. "Jake, go!" Sarah pushed him toward the ladder. He started down, the metal rungs slick with ocean spray. Above him, gunfire erupted as Sarah and Torres held their position. The evidence bag felt heavier with each rung, weighted with the knowledge that it contained enough secrets to topple governments. Halfway down, Jake heard boots on the ladder above him. Time had run out. The maintenance boat's engine coughed to life as he dropped the final 10 feet, landing hard on the deck. Keys dangled from the ignition. Platform workers must have abandoned it in their rush to safety. Dawn was breaking on the eastern horizon as Jake gunned the engine toward shore, the evidence bag secure beside him and the sound of helicopters growing louder behind him. The explosion echoed across the water as Jake's boat cleared the reef, the island disappearing behind a wall of orange flame and black smoke. He didn't look back. The encrypted drive containing decades of corporate cover-ups sat secure in his waterproof pack, along with enough evidence to topple governments and destroy careers worth billions. His satellite phone buzzed. Sarah's voice crackled through the static. "Jake, are you clear? The Coast Guard is en route to your position." "I'm out," he replied, steering toward the coordinates she'd given him. "The island's gone, but we got what we needed." Not all of it. The voice that cut through the transmission wasn't Sarah's. Jake's blood turned cold as Marcus Chen's familiar tone filled the boat's cabin. "Hello, Jake. I believe you have something that belongs to my employers." Jake's hand moved instinctively toward the GPS, but Chen's laugh stopped him. "Don't bother changing course. We've been tracking you since you left the island. Satellite technology is remarkable these days." The sound of rotor blades grew louder overhead. Jake looked up to see a black helicopter descending, its searchlight cutting through the dawn sky. Behind him, 2 speedboats emerged from the smoke, closing fast. "You killed Tommy," Jake said into the phone, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Tommy was careless. He let sentiment override good business sense. "You don't have to make the same mistake. Land on the platform we're lowering, hand over the drive, and walk away rich. Fight us, and join your friend at the bottom of the ocean." A rope ladder dropped from the helicopter, followed by a small platform that hit the water 20 yards ahead. Jake calculated his options. The speedboats were faster than his stolen vessel, and the helicopter had the high ground. But he hadn't survived 3 tours in Afghanistan by surrendering when the odds looked bad. He gunned the engine and spun the wheel hard to port, racing toward a cluster of rocky outcroppings he'd spotted on his way to the island. The boat lurched as bullets from the helicopter stitched across the water behind him. One of the speedboats tried to cut him off, but Jake had spent summers racing boats on Lake Michigan. He knew how to make them dance. The first outcropping loomed ahead, barely visible above the waterline. Jake aimed straight for the narrow gap between two rocks, praying his memory of the depth charts was accurate. The boat scraped bottom for a terrifying second, then shot through into calmer water beyond. The pursuing speedboat wasn't as lucky. Its pilot, unfamiliar with these waters, struck the rocks at full speed. The impact sent bodies flying as the boat disintegrated in a shower of fiberglass and foam. Jake's phone rang again. This time it was Sarah's voice, urgent and clear. "Jake, I've got company here too. They found our safe house. I'm transmitting the backup location now. Can you reach the mainland?" Before he could answer, the helicopter appeared overhead again, this time dropping armed men onto the rocks around him. Jake grabbed his pack and abandoned the boat, diving into the cold Pacific as automatic weapons fire shredded the vessel's hull. The water was shockingly cold, but his military training kicked in. He swam hard underwater, using the rocky outcroppings for cover as bullets churned the surface above. His lungs burned by the time he reached the far side of the formation, but he was alive and still had the drive. A fishing boat appeared on the horizon, moving fast toward his position. Jake tensed, ready to dive again, until he heard the familiar voice calling across the water. "Over here, you crazy bastard!" It was Rodriguez, his old army buddy, manning the wheel of a Coast Guard cutter. Jake had never been happier to see anyone in his life. Strong hands hauled him aboard as the helicopter wheeled away, apparently unwilling to engage federal authorities directly. "Sarah called in some favors," Rodriguez explained as they raced toward shore. "Turns out your little adventure has attracted attention from some very interested parties in Washington, the kind who don't appreciate private armies operating in American waters." Jake clutched the waterproof pack to his chest, feeling the hard outline of the drive through the fabric. "It's all here," he said. "Everything they killed for. Toxic waste dumps, bribery records, evidence of cover-ups going back 30 years. Enough to put half the defense contractors in the country out of business." "And enough to get you killed," Rodriguez replied grimly. "These people don't give up easy. You sure you want to go through with this?" Jake thought about Tommy, about the workers who died from cancers caused by illegal dumping, about the families who'd never known why their loved ones had gotten sick. He thought about the island, now a smoking crater, and all the secrets it had held. "I'm sure," he said. "Let's finish this." The Coast Guard cutter cut through the swells toward shore, carrying Jake Morrison and the evidence that would shake the world.